This November, global attention is turning to Lima, Peru, where more than 150 countries are going to be meeting under the FAO to decide the future of access to plant genetics. Their task is strengthening the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. That's the agreement that governs how plant materials are shared, protected, and improved across borders. The stakes are high. Getting it wrong risks slowing innovation, restricting access to biodiversity, and making it harder to breed the resilient crops our future depends on. So, what does getting it right look like? That's the discussion we're here for today. Joining me are three leaders who are deeply engaged in this issue for the seed sector. Welcome, gentlemen. I'll just introduce each of you. John-Pieter Schipper is Bejo Zaden's managing director. We've reached him in the Netherlands. Michael Keller, of course, is ISF Secretary General. He is in Switzerland. And Dr. David Bubeck is Corteva's Global Breeding Alliances lead. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. So this international treaty is extremely complex. It spans decades of history, policy, and of course, science. For those who might appreciate a quick primer on the treaty, we sat down with Jasmina Muminovic of the International Seed Federation to explain some background of both the international treaty and a second agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity. That full conversation is linked in the show notes below. So let's dive in. Each of you gentlemen are so well known in this field that formal introductions almost feel unnecessary. So instead, can we start on a personal note? Why does this topic matter so deeply to each of you? Let me start with you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Madeleine. Thanks for having me. Why it matters for me? Because, look, I'm Secretary General of the International Seed Federation. The Seed Federation is representing over 15,000 private seed companies worldwide. And I'm always saying, what is in our DNA? In our DNA is breeding of new varieties to increase seed choice for farmers everywhere. Why it matters, this topic? Because where starts breeding? It starts with the use of genetic resources. And the more we can increase the use of genetic resources, the better we are able to support the farmers everywhere.
Dave, how about you?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really, this topic is crucial for myself as a plant breeder and my history and training and education. Plant breeding has accomplished tremendous things in delivering food and feed and fiber and fuel for the world. But that doesn't come simply, and it doesn't come without being able to leverage genetic diversity. And when we think about successful plant breeding and improvement of plant breeding through using developing new cultivars in plant breeding, it's essential. We don't get to improve plant breeding without genetic variance. So genetic diversity is going to be essential to that. And, close to our hearts as Corteva Agriscience, we know that access to genetic diversity in the long term is going to be really critical for, future success of plant breeding, varietal development.
Excellent. John-Pieter?
Yeah, what can I add? I fully agree with the other two. And I must say, when you look at vegetables, I think in the breeding, most innovations depend, and the bigger innovations depend on new genetic resources. Then you can really make the biggest steps forward. So innovation depends on new genetic resources. And that's needed in the end for sustainable food production, for sustainability, because many things that we breed for are things like resistances, where less chemicals are needed to grow a crop. So it adds a lot to sustainability, but also to farmers' wishes and consumer wishes. So for us, critical that we have access to genetic resources.
At the center of this whole discussion is the question of how we create a system that's both fair and functional, one that supports innovation, but while also recognizing the value that countries bring through their biodiversity. Can I start by asking you, Michael, from a 10,000-foot perspective, what does a workable, fair, future-ready access and benefits sharing system look like?
Yeah, thanks, Madeleine. I think on the workable, fair, and future-ready access and benefit sharing system, just to remind ourselves, it's absolutely essential to take into account the diversity of the seed sector, diversity in terms of structure, diversity in terms of crops, and our members are working in over 90 crops, and diversity also of markets and regions and farmers where our members are working on. I think this is an essential driver to make the system running by taking into account absolutely diversity means also more flexibility. And I think that the value emerging from genetic resources is there when it's shared and developed. And we have all a joint responsibility towards genetic resources, which starts with conservation, but then it needs to be accessible and used. Breeding today is the harvest of tomorrow. That means access and use of genetic resources are an essential driver for innovation. Means, in other words, what's a fair system? A fair system must support both conservation, because we have a joint responsibility to the conservation of genetic resources, but also it should allow, which is an essential driver to increase also harvest and to address all the topics, continued private investment in breeding. This is important, in breeding, to address the diverse challenges. Therefore, I would just summarize it. We need a multilateral, self-sustaining system with very predictable access, because I think this is certainly a point we come later back on. Investment in breeding, it's a long-term investment. It takes time and money. We need to have predictable rules, and it needs to have economical sound payment rates, I would say.
John-Pieter, let me bring you in. Do you agree with Michael's vision of what workable looks like?
Well, I kind of see it in the same way, with the addition that, well, I think what is the most important, that genetic resources are accessible in an easy way, in a simple way, and it starts with conservation. If the conservation is well organized across the world, different countries, and you can access it through gene banks, for example, that makes it easy. But if then also the way you can access it is simply organized, then I would almost say it's not only accessible for the big corporates, because we can organize ourselves. We can also deal with complex systems. But there are many, many smaller breeding companies that are not in that position. So if you want to make it fair, I think fair is simple, accessible. And that we have to pay something for an input in our business. We have to pay for many inputs in our business. So that there is a payment for access to genetic resources, that is fine. But make it simple, because then it's fair and accessible for everybody.
Dave, turning to you, how does this play out inside a global research and development organization like Corteva? If we get this framework right, what does it open up for breeders and researchers? And if we don't, what's at risk?
Yeah, and this discussion has, as you pointed out at the very beginning, been going on for a very long time. In the midst of that very long time, access has been possible through bilateral agreements, but a simplification towards, towards widespread access and value sharing. I mean, these are all good and positive things. I think Michael well said, this balance between the importance of collecting and maintaining germplasm banks is critical. Otherwise, there will be no access. If there, however, is no utilization, which is partly limited by access, then, the value of these and the world, our society will eventually get weary of spending money to just maintain these collections if there is no utilization. So we have to find a reasonable path to access, value sharing, and incentivizing utilization. One other thing I want to point out is that the more intensively that organizations breed, both public and private sector breed over time, the greater the distance in performance between these materials that sit in a germplasm bank and the materials that are used and recycled and produce commercial output and varieties and hybrids. And so the challenge of utilization becomes greater over time. And so it's important to characterize what's in the collections, what's under germplasm, under the multilateral system, and then ensuring that there is a pathway to access for both from the smallest to the largest companies in the world, as well as the public sector. But we need to think of other ways for incenting that utilization, because it's not an easy path for a plant breeder.
So let's take a step back and maybe look at what's actually on the table in the discussions in Lima. As Yasmina Muminovic outlined in our background discussion in more detail, and again, that is linked in the comments below, there are essentially 3 hotspots. That's what they're being called through this working negotiation, 3 hotspots, 3 major points that will dominate the negotiations. I want to dig into each of those points. Let's start with the payment mechanisms and rates, which are really a front and center issue. The sector as a whole broadly supports reasonable benefit sharing, but there's concern that a one-size-fits-all subscription model could disadvantage, John-Pieter, you mentioned smaller players, or potentially certain crop types. So what, from your perspective, would a truly workable model look like? One that recognizes the diversity of crops, of regions, of course, of company sizes involved. John-Pieter, can I ask you first?
Yeah, you can. If I talk for Bejo Zaden, then I would say subscription for the full assortment. We are breeding in 40 crops. And for all 40, we use genetic resources from across the world. So for me, subscription for the whole assortment would be very well workable. But I understand that there are some other crops where maybe subscription for your full assortment, that might be a different discussion. So subscription for a crop or an assortment or maybe one session. If you make it a little bit more flexible, I think you serve the different types of companies and crops, etc. So a bit of flexibility there, I think, would be helpful. For me, ideal, and then I'm talking about vegetable breeding companies, I would say put all the crops on the annex and have a subscription fee and include DSI, and we are done. Then we are happy. Then we can work and kind of, and there is the payment. That's fair enough. The payment is there, and we have to negotiate the right level of payment. Also, that should be a level that is doable, of course, in the end. But I would be very happy when that would be the outcome.
Okay, I like what you did there, John-Pieter, of bringing all 3 of those key hotspot points into your perspective. Maybe I can ask Dave and Michael to do the same.
Yeah. So, as far as rates, rates need to be affordable for all and reasonable, rational for all, from the smallest to the largest of companies. I think, in dealing with bilateral agreements is the way that we've been dealing with it so far, that, we've found rates that we have come to agreement on in the bilateral system. So I think, the level, the size of the rates definitely matter. I think we're also a little different perspective from vegetable species to field crop species, and the major field crops, the 10 or so field crops that Corteva breeds in, would have a little different perspective on the utility of accessing materials that are in the multilateral system. In terms of annex, I agree completely that we should all the crops should be annexed across vegetables and field crops. That was always difficult to understand why some crops were set aside and were not included in the annex. So I think we as a general group, Corteva, but I think the industry is moving in the direction of, yes, supportive of annexing these other things, the other crop species. I view digital sequence information as inseparable from the germplasm itself. That the best way to incentivize someone in the private sector or public sector to utilize materials in the multilateral system is if it goes with DSI information, it gives us a clue, a hook into genetic information that says that a given accession may be of interest to a breeder. So to me, DSI, the value of DSI information is inseparable from the germplasm itself. So I think having a common system across DSI is not where it should be in the materials that live under the multilateral system. We can generate a lot more digital sequence information and genotyping that we want at a much denser map than would be available. DSI information is getting lower and lower cost to generate all the time. So I think materials that are in the multilateral system, we need to think about collectively how do we generate that data and how is that data utilized and accessed. But I think it should all be rolled in the same system of a payment rate and that consideration, yes.
Coming back on the point I made in the intro, I think the essential one is to take into account by addressing the three hotspots, the need for a diverse solution and a more flexible solution. There's not one size fits all solution. This means we need a flexible combination of access payment models from full subscription, like John-Pieter mentioned before, but also for other companies who are only interested perhaps in one or two crops to go for a subscription, but also taking account perhaps at another level, companies who only need one single access in their breeding programs for specific markets to have a single access mechanism. I think absolutely essential to take into account the diversity of our members. Secondly, and this is a broad consensus within the seed sector, is broadening the scope of Annex 1 beyond the 64, because as mentioned also earlier by Dave, we have so many challenges within environmental topics, but also nutrition, food security topics. It's essential that we can also build a multilateral system on crops beyond the 64, on DSI. That's a very difficult discussion. Could be a legal discussion, CBD, international treaty, multilateral system, Nagoya protocols. How to fix this? That means in any case, when we pay, we are looking for it's taken into account, also covering DSI. The problem is we can say this, and we would ask this, and we will ask this certainly in the discussions. But even the treaty has not the legitimacy to say that's like it is, because there's still another body there like CBD, and there the important opinions can diverse. And this is something where also we feel a little bit in this discussion, what can we do? Our call is clear. We do not want to pay double. And once we are subscribing or we are paying, it needs to be covered. I think that's the baseline for us. Then how this is implemented, this is another question.
John-Pieter and Dave, I wanted to ask each of you, are there what I would call red lines, as in, would there be times where participation would become unrealistic? If decisions are made in Lima, are there red lines where participation would be too costly, too unpredictable, and it would directly impact your ability to move forward, or perhaps smaller companies' ability to move forward on innovation and new breeding? John-Pieter, I see you sort of nodding. Can I ask you first?
Yeah, for me, red lines or at least unworkable outcomes would be when the annex is not filled with other crops. If a part of your crops are on the annex and for the rest of the crops you have to use the CBD system, then it's getting messy, and there is not that much benefit we have from the treaty then. So that would be one. I would say the rates in the end, of course, make whether it's workable or not. And I tend to say, as a business, what you pay for your inputs is part of your cost price, so that will be reflected in the end also in market prices. And so if it's too high, it's not per se only the breeding companies that you hurt, but you hurt the whole market. If it's an unrealistic high fee that we have to pay. And I think also when genetic resources are included, but DSI is still out and we need to have another system for DSI, if it's too complex, we will be reluctant to subscribe to any of the systems. And probably you'll find your ways, try to find your ways with less genetic resources in your breeding programs, which is not what we want and which is not good for the business.
David, do you want to add to that?
I agree with everything John-Pieter said. I think certainly the price tag of a subscription system, that you can go too high. I don't think you can go too low, but that can be prohibitive to all sizes of companies, from small to largest. So the amount of that subscription rate is going to be, carefully watched. I think, the Annex 1 needs to be expanded. That to me, if that is not done, that's that will be a bit of a non-starter for many of us, I believe. Also, I will add one thing about all of the dollars paid into whatever the payment mechanism is. It needs to be more transparency as to where those dollars actually flow. And of interest to us greatly is that enough of those dollars flow into those that are keepers of the germplasm in the multilateral system to enable that system to be functional and sustainable over a long period of time. And how do these collections get maintained? And so one example in that I'll give is that when Pioneer Hybrid gave $1 million to the Latin American Maize Project, it was very clear where the funding was going to be utilized. Very purposeful, very intentional, to some extent philanthropic, but of global and an interest of humanity. With the Global Trust and what established Svalbard, it was very clear where the funds were going to support that. So when the legacy companies of Corteva supported that Global Trust, it was very clear where the funding was going. So that, I think, needs to have clarity too.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to that. I fully agree. If it's transparent where the money goes, if you look at conservation of genetic resources, I think in Holland we have a very good and well-organized gene bank that is in contact with many other gene banks in the world, trying to support them, sometimes teach them how to set up a good gene bank locally. And the gene bank in Holland works so well because of all the support of the seed companies in Holland. That is support in kind, and that is also support with money. And so it's absolute that we are willing to contribute to conservation of genetic resources. There's no discussion about that, and it helps when it's a bit transparent where the money goes, where it's spent on, and as long as it's in the benefit of genetic resource conservation, you will have little discussion if that's clear. If that's not clear, you will have more discussion. That is what it will be.
So it feels in this room that there is agreement, at least on some points in what needs to move forward. Of course, the seed sector is not going to be the parties making the final decisions. It's going to be decided by the countries participating in the treaty negotiation. So can I ask each of you, what's your call to action, both for the policymakers who are going to be meeting in Lima, and then also for the broader seed industry who is watching from the sidelines, but has opportunity in some ways to influence the process? Dave, can I start with you?
Yeah, let me just try a quick run on. So I think in influencing the ability to influence policymakers, we as member companies can go directly to the agencies around the world. But I think a stronger advocacy actually to our position would be to go through the various seed trade associations, International Seed Federation, of which Michael well represents us and listens to us as members of the association. The American Seed Trade Association has a very direct line of influence to the U.S. government. So leveraging those trade associations to help us with that advocacy is a good outcome.
Yeah, looking at at Lima, so to say, it feels a little bit it's now or never. Positions basically have been taken, and probably decisions will be made, and we have to respect the fact that, after the lobbying and telling them how we look at those things, that others probably decide, and we are not the ones to decide, but the ones that will decide, I would call to them and say, keep focus on the aim. The aim is making genetic resources accessible for the innovation in food production, and we are willing to pay for that. That's fair enough, but keep it simple. Keep it simple, so in the end you reach the goal that it's accessible, it's used for innovation in food production, and I think then with that as a baseline, you make good decisions.
Beautiful. Michael?
Look, I would start also with a reminder of what the private sector is doing. And look, I'm now the vice chair of the Donors Council in the Crop Trust. What is happening in the Crop Trust, also through contribution of the private sector to the conservation and maintaining gene bank, is essential. This is showing also our responsible way of doing. Secondly, I would remind also, it's not only about rates and access. What is also essential is the work we are doing in non-benefit sharing activities, some knowledge transfer, training farmers. And I think public-private partnership. We just signed a memorandum of understanding with CJR to discuss further the use of genetic resources and to discuss further public-private partnership, breeding programs, and bringing solutions to the farm. I think we need to also policymakers sometimes to broaden the scope and the understanding what the private sector is doing and what the private sector can do. Also, this is a call for me for biodiversity-rich countries is also, I would, as a policymaker, I would think about, I ask the private sector, come in my country, build breeding programs on my genetic resources existing there. This is not only about rates. I think this is also important to remind ourselves. The call would be strengthen multilateralism in a very difficult context, for sure. Clarify the relationship between the international treaty and the CBD on DSI, for sure. We are ready to go. We are responsible actors, but the predictability is essential, and it needs to make business-wise sense for us. I would say, like John-Pieter, that's perhaps the last chance to make it happen. If it's not happening here, we need to find alternative solutions.
So we are truly at a pivot
Yes.
point in the future of how we are going to be moving forward with plant breeding. To close us out on this conversation, what gives you hope in this debate? What's a sign that progress, real balanced progress, is possible in Lima?
I don't think there's necessarily one way to solve this. The best way to solve it is to recognize that it is a shared societal problem. It's a global problem. And we need to find clarity in sending the world to why it's important to not only maintain the collections, but utilize them. So I think the fact that this has been debated and so many different angles and permutations of solutions have been considered, that alone raises the attention to the world. That there's some success in that, even though the journey's been long, and the clarity of this, what is the possible solution, has been really complicated and not always agreed upon, for sure. But I think it's raising the attention of the importance of the germplasm and of biodiversity, and I think that in and of itself is a good outcome. If Lima isn't a success by our measure of it, there will be solution paths that are identified to this global challenge. So that doesn't sound very optimistic, but I do find over multiple paths, there will be a solution identified.
We should not only think on rights and interests, we need to think beyond on shared responsibilities. And I would like to emphasize one thing. We have all a shared responsibility when it comes up to biodiversity, towards future generations, to farmers, and provide solutions by seed choice. Here we are, not more, but also not less, thinking beyond rights, thinking on what is needed to fulfill our shared responsibility. And this makes me thinking, because I think here we have more in common also between the private sector and governments and public breeding and civil society and indigenous people and farmers than we are sometimes saying by discussing only rates, annexes, and DSI.
John-Pieter,
the last word goes to you.
What gives me hope? I would say if the parties that are discussing in Lima also feel that it's a kind of now or never, and they are put in a pressure cooker with all the different stands, point of views, I hope that in the end the common interest of having access to genetic resources will prevail, and there will be good solutions to make sure that there is a good outcome, which is in the end in the benefit of all farmers across the world in developed and developing countries, big or small, doesn't matter. But I truly believe that if they feel that is the common goal, then we can come to solutions in a pressure cooker.